Hellblade 1 and 2 aren't good games. Both have pacing issues, boring combat design, and their puzzles left a lot to be desired. In the case of Hellblade 1, it relied too much on one kind of puzzle, which slowed down the pacing. And in the case of Hellblade 2, it didn't have enough puzzles, and the puzzles were so easy that it just felt like it was padding out the game. And I think the Hellblade series really struggles with almost an identity crisis, where on one hand it wants to be a walking simulator style game where they give you this amazing narrative, and then on the other side it tries to be a compelling third-person action puzzle game, and I think it's that conflict that puts the series in a weird place. Now that isn't to say that they're all bad, because it's safe to say that these games are the epitome of games as art. Some people love them, some people hate them, and for me, despite its issues, Hellblade 1 resonated with me like no other game. It's a tale of a woman who was cast out from her people because of her darkness, which is essentially the psychosis that makes this game stand out. And then as for Hellblade 2, it has the same problems as the first and failed to evolve the game, bar the technical side of things. Hellblade 2 is worse in almost every way than the original, and I don't want to be disrespectful, but it was a 5.5 hour game that felt like it was 20 hours long. So I started playing Hellblade 1 just about a week ago. And at the start, it was slow. I will admit there was very little kind of keeping me going. It was more just, oh, I'd like to see the payoff of this game. Obviously, from a technical standpoint, if you take what Ninja Theory were back then, they were a much smaller developer. They would have been on the AA side, and to see what they achieved technically back then was absolutely phenomenal. The graphics, even to this day, look fantastic. The facial animations and the motion capture are some of the best around. And then, of course, when you're talking about the audio design of this game is simply spectacular. When you put a set of headphones on and you have one voice in your left ear, one voice behind you, one voice in your right ear, I think they did an amazing job at capturing that feeling of just being overwhelmed by all of these different voices telling you one thing or the other. And in this game, they have that shock value, because I can't think of another game that does something like this, where they try to explore mental health in this way, even to go as far as have voices in your head. So it really stands out for that, and it did have that shock value of something that I've never really experienced before. And even though the start of the game was quite slow, and I wasn't really sure if I was going to enjoy the game, there was something unique about that kept me going. For the first bit of the game, you're fighting enemies, you're doing these perspective-based puzzles that eventually all run their course, and after hour 2 or 3, you've basically seen everything that the game has to offer. And then you get into the middle section of the game when they really introduce the story of Seanua and her boyfriend or husband or whatever, Dillian. And it's when you start to bring in those human relationships is when it really starts to hit. A lot of people have suffered with some form of mental illness in their lives, or they have dealt with a loved one who has also suffered from mental illness, and both are two extremely difficult situations to be in. And at that point, what I took from the story is that Seanua blamed all of the bad things that have happened around her on herself. Her mom dies, Dillian dies, and it seems to be that the darkness was the thing that caused it. And that's when I got really invested in the story. It showed how Seanua put Dillian on a pedestal, and how she was describing when she first saw him and he was practicing with his weapons and he was almost dancing around. It was really elegant, and you could see just how much she idolized Dillian as a person, and that's where she derived a lot of the joy in her life. And then once that was gone, it was taken from her, and then you get basically the journey of trying to deal with that. And I think it really hits home on that dynamic, on how important somebody can be to one person. When somebody has that person that is so important to them, and then the person goes away, disappears, dies, whatever happens to them, they're no longer in their life. And I love how it shows both sides of it. You have Dillian, who was almost this idyllic character who was full of life and laughter and love, and then you have Seanua, who's this dark and gloomy character. And in that moment in Hellblade 1, I kind of forgot all of the issues. Like, I could sit here and rap off so many different things, how there was a massive over-reliance on one type of puzzle, how the puzzles weren't exactly hard, so it just felt like padding. The combat is like totally fine and it looks cool, but again, it's not exactly hard and not exactly engaging. But the payoff at the end of Hellblade 1 and that sort of middle part is kind of what made that game resonate with me, and why I was honestly so excited to play Hellblade 2, and hoping that they would further that development of Seanua and you'd be able to hopefully maybe see what would happen at the end of her journey. And unfortunately, with Hellblade 2, I was just left feeling empty, because I think as a sequel they failed in almost every single aspect. Look, the game looks fantastic. It's easily one of the best looking games I've ever played, even on the Series S, where you can see sometimes the resolution is kind of low, but you could just see the fidelity of this game. Everything is super realistic. The facial animations are probably the best I've ever seen. All the animations are really slick. It's a really cinematic experience, and the audio, you know, only matches it and just creates this absolutely amazing audio visual package that stands out. And I do wonder what this game would have been like if it had launched with the Xbox as a technical showcase of what its console can do, because I think these sort of tech demo games kind of get a different rap when they're released with the console, and they're definitely given a bit more leniency. But here the console is nearly 4 years old, so it doesn't really hit the same. But just to touch on the gameplay, the combat very clearly went for this cinematic approach where it does look really good. If you watch this on a video, it looks class, and it does. It looks fantastic. But when you're playing it, it just kind of feels a bit slow. Hellblade 1 didn't feel this slow. Hellblade 1 was kind of a bit arcadey, where you could dodge and do these like dodge slash attacks, and you could run and do jumping attacks, or you can dodge forward and do a jab attack. So you had like tiny little combos there that kind of made it feel arcadey. But in Hellblade 2, they really went into this realism, like you're going to feel every hit and you're going to feel every dodge, and Seanua is probably going to nearly trip over every time she dodges, and every hit's going to feel impactful, which is cool. But it's kind of cool in the Rockstar sense, where it's like, this looks really good, but when you're actually playing it, it just kind of feels a bit unresponsive and sluggish. And then the enemy pool is like laughable. There's a handful of enemies, and if I'm being honest, once you fight the enemy once, you know exactly how to dodge their attacks or which attacks you can parry. So the combat, obviously you're not coming to this game for the combat, but it just doesn't inspire anything in me. There's only one standout combat encounter, and that's because of how cinematic it is. But I think if you're coming to a game and you're trying to be like an action-y puzzle game, and you're sitting there saying that the best combat encounter is the one that's the most cinematic, I think you might have lost something in translation there. And then when you get onto the puzzles, they are almost the exact same as Hellblade 1. They're way easier, which the ones in Hellblade 1 weren't even that difficult. And they're just the exact same thing of looking perspective-wise. Oh, you need to find this symbol. But the game like hones in on the symbol really easily. So basically, you just kind of need to get to roughly where the area is, where that symbol is, hold R2, and then just look around, and eventually it'll snap to it. So the puzzles are just, I don't know. There's absolutely... There's never an aha moment in either of the games. In Hellblade 1 and 2, you never have that aha moment. Oh, that's so cool. You know, when you're playing the Pathless, or maybe you're playing Breath of the Wild, and you get that puzzle, and you get the little jingle, and you're like, oh god, I can't believe I saw that. That was really funny, or fun, or interesting. That doesn't happen in this game. From a gameplay perspective, this Hellblade should have been a walking simulator. They needed to commit to it being a walking simulator, and then you go into it with different expectations. But because they have these combat experiences and these puzzles, it's kind of like straddling the line, and it should have been in the middle, okay? So the gameplay isn't amazing. You're not coming to this for the gameplay. But then the story itself, I don't like the direction they took. And it's mostly for one reason. So Hellblade 1, which, as I said, is a game that I really like, focused on this isolation. That's what the game was. It was Seanua, it was the voices in her head, and that was it. It was just this claustrophobic internal monologue story. That's the only story that you got, and it just felt like there was so much weight on it. It was dark, it was gloomy. It was one of them games that was honestly kind of tough to play because of how serious and dark it was. And I loved how alone you feel as you play that game. But then Hellblade 2 does the same thing, okay? It does the same thing where you have the voices in your head. But in Hellblade 1, the voices they weren't a way to teach you where to go. They were almost there to mess you over. Like, you would have one in your head, it's like, oh yeah, this is the right way. Oh no, this is the wrong way. Oh, maybe we should turn back, or maybe we should do this, or no, you're not doing that right. And it wouldn't be a tooltip, essentially, in your head of this is how you do it. But in Hellblade 2, that's exactly what it was. When you're in the combat, they're like, he's weak. He knows how to read your attack patterns, or whatever they said, something along them lines. And when you're doing a puzzle, it's like, yes, this is the right way. And it was almost, you know, the way you have Atreus or Aloy speaking to themselves. That's what it was, but that's what the voices were now. And it kind of removes that almost, is it true, is it not kind of thing that Hellblade 1 had going for itself. But now they introduce basically 3 main characters that join you along on your journey. One joins from the start, and then one kind of in the sort of middle, and then one very near the end. And I just don't think they were given enough time to be fully fleshed out, because the game is 5.5, 6 hours long. So try to flesh out 3 characters in 5.5 hours. It's a very difficult task, and I think they failed. And because they focused on the world, it almost felt like a story about mythology and not about Seanua and her dealing with something. Because in Hellblade 1, I think the themes were conveyed really well to the player. Like, this is very clearly about grief and what grief can do to a person. And it's showing how Seanua deals with all of this death that's happened around her and the journey to kind of overcome it. And how potentially the darkness kind of gets worse because of it. And that really hit me. But here, I don't know what the theme of this game is. I really don't. At one point, I thought they were trying to show that maybe if you have sort of like friends to help you along, then things become a bit easier. But I don't think that was the theme, because at certain points, it seems the voices calm down when there's people around. And I don't know if that was like a deliberate narrative choice so that you could hear people, or is that symbolizing? Am I reading too much into this? That is like symbolizing as like, oh, you have all these people around you now and they're here to help you, and that kind of helps with it. But I'm honestly sitting here recording this video and I do not know what the main theme of Hellblade 2 was. And I think that's the biggest downfall of the game. I don't care about the characters. The emotional moments it gives you don't resonate because the characters I don't really care about. And it's almost like Seanua, she's the main character, but the game doesn't have that laser focus like the first one did, and I think it just loses a lot because of it. For Hellblade 1, I forgave them issues when that story beat hit me, because at that point, then the game was about the story. It was about Seanua, it was about Dillion, it was about that relationship that really hit me. But with Hellblade 2, I was going through with the exact same thoughts as Hellblade 1. The combat isn't overly amazing. The puzzles aren't hard. The game just kind of feels slow, and it feels deliberately slow, but not in a good way. It doesn't come across very well. And I was waiting for that moment, that story moment, to come in and just slap me across the face and just get me right in the heart. And it never happened. And I think that's why Hellblade 2 is way worse than the first one. And I don't really recommend you play it. I think it was a very long 5.5 hours for me personally. And with Hellblade 1 and 2, I think you can have a very similar experience to how I had, where maybe Hellblade 2 resonates more with you and then you forgive its issues. And Hellblade 1 didn't really resonate with you. But for me, Hellblade 2 didn't hit me whatsoever. I'm glad I played it to sort of see the technical marvel of it, because, you know, it is obviously a technical achievement. But as a game, I don't know. It's not good. I don't recommend it. I recommend Hellblade 1. Give that a shot. Yeah. That's Hellblade 1 and 2. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe. Goodbye.